Hi, Besnik.
Hi, Zahi.
Very good to have you. We're with Besnik Vrellaku, the CEO of SalesFlow, which is a sales engagement platform, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first of all, we're on the Meet.Capital Startup Podcast, where we talk about things that help startups, especially early startups, grow. And Besnik, you're a very inspiring entrepreneur. I know you've built and been involved with a lot of companies, and now you're leading SalesFlow, which is quite an exciting success story. That a company that grew over the last year. I also have been kind of following the journey of SalesFlow. So very happy to have you.
Thank you. Likewise, I'm excited to dive into some key stories and answer any questions and beyond. So thank you for having me.
Perfect. So maybe you can start us off by telling us a bit about how you built SalesFlow, maybe a bit about your background if you'd like to add, but I'd like to know about how you built SalesFlow and specifically on how you funded it, because I know a lot of it was really bootstrapped, which is unusual for a software company.
Sure. Well, I think if you look at taking a step back, it's always they say that the dots connect ultimately over time that lead to where you are, and I've had in the past since I was young, since the sort of age of 16. At the early age, I've had a lot of MVPs in the course of last sort of 10 plus years. And ultimately, I went from B2C and then dived into B2B in a sort of sequential way. And each of those B2B sort of MVPs that I created over those years, completely bootstrapped, very sort of experimental led validation and so forth. When I moved on to creating SalesFlow, at the beginning, one problem they all had in the previous MVPs that were created was that they all needed leads and opportunities to drive our pipeline. So that was one of the key things that I wanted to go involved and solve. So then, of course, the existence of cold email and LinkedIn really became a cornerstone to how to make that metrics work. So a lot of it, before we started developing the solution, you would use humans. You would validate it by, hey, let's try it manually, because this kind of method was working through Vision. There's another company that I'm part of, for financial planning and financial planning and forecasting. I was using initially methods to grow that business. And one of the key things that we realized is that the particular methods that we're using in conjunction with both LinkedIn and email was phenomenal compared to the conventional cold calling, because you need manpower to do that. So we can afford it as a business. We even had funding for Vision at that time. So then you have a large budgets for advertisement. Not everybody has a large budget. So what happens is that what are you left with to do prospecting, to do business development? Ultimately, you need to find ways to to generate predictable pipeline, at least opportunities, conversations. And that was really on LinkedIn and email. Those were the two cornerstone channels that worked manually very well. So then we thought, look, we're getting all these opportunities and effectively at $10 per acquired lead, for example. That's incredibly low for high overview B2B opportunities. Because most, if you're talking about $500, maybe $1,000 per opportunity gained through ads. That's an incredible number if you look at the unit economics. So that's how ultimately we want to find ways to automate that naturally. And this was, by the way, 7 years ago, right? It wasn't amassed by 3,001 tools out there. It was still fairly new. And, to some degree, we created a lot of the LinkedIn outreach category, because that's when the flood of competition came out, ultimately from that. And that's kind of how, at least, why we decided to create SalesFlow was because we were solving a problem that worked manually, ultimately, right? The whole point of software
and you were
automation.
solving a problem for yourself. So this was something that you were doing for your own companies,
Yeah.
and realized that it worked, and then figured out that this is something probably lots of companies work. So you had a very intimate understanding of the problem
Yep.
and the demand for it, and then you went ahead and built a solution for
Exactly. You precisely that, because sometimes people forget, like, ultimately you're your best customer. Like, if it solves your problem and you're able to find a way that you can do this for others, then excellent. Because even in the past, like, every idea that I was pouncing on, particularly if a lot of business owners out there that are trying to work out what to do, it's like, well, figure out what problems you have and solve those, because you are your best customer. So that's where a lot of my MVPs became, because whether I was trying to book something, for example, on a site that wasn't available, I want to solve that problem. Then I had a real estate challenge where I was trying to find a way to better manage all these viewings or real estate listings or contract and deposits, for example. That was another venture way back, because I was solving my own problem. So you've nailed you've absolutely smashed it, because that's exactly how it works. Because there's no point trying to solve someone else's problem when you don't really know it 110%. And the best way to experience problems is to branch out your experience, ultimately, right? To find the right sort of ideas for businesses that you generally solving. And then it's up to you to understand the magnitude of the problem you're tackling. Because it can be a micro a problem where it's, people still willing to solve by paying money, or a macro problem, in which case, sometimes it really requires a lot of funding, a lot of capital to really have an impact.
Yeah, I can really relate to the way you started, because Meet.Capital was born in a similar way. We had a startup that at some point had the idea of building a marketplace for investors and founders, and we wanted to bring a lot of investors on. So we got very good at reaching and connecting to investors, and then I realized that in itself is really what the startups need, and so I started the agency. So yeah, I can really relate to that. I think it's a great way to start. And when you started SalesFlow, how did you kick it off? That is, I think, maybe the hardest part.
You're absolutely right. There's a small story with this. As the inflection point of growth begun, I remember all the MVPs before I was spending a lot of money, personal money, completely bootstrapped in creating MVPs. Obviously not at perhaps at 100, 200K a pop, but ultimately it compiled up. So I realized I wanted to work with a partner, and I found a co-founder, CTO, for example, to work collectively. I'm more on the commercial front. I mean, I did some good in the past. So obviously that married up. We built a solution, very low cost. We talk about funding. Like, people typically even need money for product, people, or perhaps growth ultimately, right? So I solved that puzzle of creating the business through a CTO, naturally paying in equity, but I'm perfectly fine with it. I believe in good partnerships and so forth. So that's what we did. Then the next question became, well, how do we commercialize? How much money do we spend to grow it? You need to build a lot of infrastructure behind it. You still need resources to, Amazon Web Services, never mind commercial websites and perhaps marketing. And it was 2019, I think. And I recall I brought in a graduate to help me with a lot of administration setup, because at the time, by the way, I was working on a few different other businesses as well. So this was kind of begun sort of 50-50 at the beginning to help me. And then realized, I was spreading myself too thin. And at that time, towards, I think it was, I was in Oxford. I was still living with my parents. All those MVPs are not free. Luckily, at least in sort of an Albanian household, you have you live rent free. So that gave me a lot of ground to experiment, to grow. And thereafter, I remember I had about, I think it was, I screenshotted it somewhere. I had £950 left in my bank account. Literally, this is not some kind of smoke and mirror stories. I thought to myself, I've got to pay this graduate. Obviously, it was a beginning stages. Like, okay, how much? What am I going to do now? I've got a month left. So the funniest thing was, it's very unexpected, but we grew, of Facebook groups. So it's very unusual. It's not advertisement. So I worked with a lot of people, at least a few individuals, And I was thinking, how am I going to grow this? So I began speaking to influencers and partners and saying, okay, because we had some revenue, but not enough to really cover ground about what we're going to do in the next quarter in 2020. So then what happened was actually, so 2018 at the end. I can't remember exactly. I've lost track. So then what happened was that I said, I spoke to this fella in this owner, had 20,000 plus people in his members and groups, all growth hackers, growth marketeers, predominantly in the US. And I spoke to him. We did a small ebook. I had a call with him. I tried to explain one anchor feature. Because if you're a software tech business, if you want to work with key partners, all it takes is one particular feature for them to be able to resonate and to use that as an anchor point to promote you, whether it's paid or free. In our case, it was completely free because he loved the Zapier integration way in which how you can use all the email and LinkedIn data to retarget through Facebook ads, where Facebook ads was quite big at the time, right? So, and that's what happened. We created an ebook and we just promoted the business. So the next month, we just grew massively. So that's the journey. That's the inflection point.
And the last moment, literally, for you.
Yes. I had no more growth hacking methods to do. Whilst we use our own tool, but it works. But we were selling at the beginning a very low entry price point at $49, and obviously we increased it to $99 over time. But like you can't, you need large numbers to make that work. Unless you're enterprise in B2B, AOV of perhaps 20, 30 plus K, then it makes more sense, right? But so that's why we needed, transactional marketing like that to make work. And it was Facebook groups.
And at what point, if at all, did you think of raising money? Because a lot of founders, I think, in a situation where you were, where you really believe in the potential, it's still early, and it makes sense that it's hard to get the first customers, and definitely for SaaS, and your price point is low, and even if you get a bunch of customers in the beginning, it's not enough to really sustain the company. So I think a lot of founders would go to raise money at that stage. So what were your thoughts about that?
I guess, being still 26 at that time, right? Like whilst I knew the ecosystem quite well, it was just not the time. I mean, when you have 2-3 months, you're going to grow or, your operations going to cut. So you can either focus on growing the business or raising funds at that time. That was my situation I was under. But then what happened was we grew enough that I didn't need angel investment. Pre-seed rounds typically was already done. We built the product with my CTO. So my circumstance for that particular business was that we were customer funded. And so that was kind of our journey. However, this story is naturally not the same for everybody. Everybody has a different product, and ultimately, it varies. Remember, not micro. We solved the micro problem at that time, right? It wasn't a macro because it was very focused on the particular channels, and then we grew a lot more macro. And this is where the funding piece comes in. So the story is always different for everybody. But my opinion is because if I look back in hindsight, right, even as a bootstrap business, I could probably triple the revenue that we have in the business in ARR terms, right? Because, I don't just hire graduates. I don't just hire, remote freelancers. At the beginning stages are really important. Or you hire more developers to reduce churn. Because you're limiting your developers, you're solving only so much bugs. So I would say that as soon as we grew probably back in 2019 to our first, because we grew the business, first 24 months, that stage over 2 million plus really quickly. So we managed to then find ways to reinvest it back naturally. We weren't just using it as a cash cow at that time. We still reinvested back in the business, into the product. But I would say, just to answer your question, is that once you know that growth curve is happening, that's when you seek out investment. But we did it at Vision, for example. We did it pre-revenue, pre-seed, because it was a macro problem. It was very different. It was very complex. So it really depends on the product and how the intensity of the problem you're solving. So if it's high in macro scale and technology development, what we're doing took us 6 months to develop. Vision, for example, took over 5 years. You need some serious cash before you get to revenue. That's why pre-revenue businesses get funded, is because it's high in IP, proprietary patterns and beyond, right? For example. So in the case of Salesforce, if it's a quick product micro, you want to get some cash in, then you need at least 500K ARR to get good terms with investors at seed level.
And when you reached that point, did you go out to raise capital?
We didn't. I didn't, in fact. Mainly because at that time, we were self-funding the business. So we were really focused on how to continue being bootstrapped, for example. We did at one point, I mean, we've had many VCs where they came to us, for example, wanted to invest a tremendous amount of money. And we even now, after 5 years, we're really debating about which path to take. And so it comes to a point where you hit a revenue point, VCs are coming knocking at your door and wanting to invest. In that case, your terms are going to be with you. So there are moments we've been considering and to do that, but there were moments where we're like, okay, this could take some money. How fast do we want to grow this? So I think, but I guess this is a lesson to those that are thinking about bootstrapping, because we could have been a lot more. And when I look back, we should have raised money probably when we hit at least a 2 million ARR mark, personally, to really grow and just take the market even more. But, decision in hindsight is that you're always going to make the right or bad calls. You don't really know ultimately. But I would say when you reach that mark, I think that's when you sort of look to raise one round personally, because we did it at Vision, for example. We could have done a lot more. For example, there's a second round of investment we're looking to close as part of what we want to do to get it to revenue. And this one we're looking to scale. So there's very different stories. And a few other businesses that we're looking at, because we sort of have a holdco at the moment where we're approaching that level. So again, it depends on the micro and macro and what stage and what terms and what solution you're solving. But for me personally, I when I look back, is get it to a strong level of unit economics where you get better terms and you raise one round instead of 100K, 500K, 2 million, the 10 million Series A. Get 2 million of maybe perhaps funding is enough to really create a positive EBITDA to then reinvest back into the business. So that's my view. That way you still remain a lot of control of the business, but equally you still have enough cash, so you don't have to look after your mental health, because being bootstrapped is not. I think there's a thumbs up. Is not always for everybody.
Yeah, is there like a consideration of planning how you want to exit, or how long do you think you'll reach an exit? Is that also part of the considerations that you had or are having when thinking about fundraising?
If I'm not mistaken, you're saying what is sort of the exit strategy of SalesFlow in particular, or just generally?
The question of whether to bring in outside capital and grow faster, but you're of course paying with part of the company, has to be tied to the end goal and how you see the end goal of the company, and what do you expect, how long will it take to reach that end goal. So if the end goal is to be sold, that's one thing. If the end goal is an IPO, so are those some thoughts that you were having?
I think at that stage you're just focused on how do I just grow the business. It depends on where you see it category wise, for example. But ultimately, exit is always on most founders there. Like if it's like you sell a service, then you sell a business, right? Ultimately, like your goal in business is to always sell somewhere. So if you're selling to IPO, you're selling to a large list of shareholders that want to invest and buy stock from your business. So ultimately, it's always going to be about a sale. I know that sometimes I've been dabbling on the hold and keep perspective, depending on the VCs, because some mandates, if you're getting in VC investment, that mandate is between 5 to 8 years. They need their return. Ultimately, that's with their LPs, general partners. They need their returns. If you're getting money from just angels, they might be a lot more flexible and long term, or family offices, for example. So it depends also what you want. But personally, for us, it's always been in mind to let's grow it for 5 to 10 years. and see what happens. Because there's ultimately three REITs: you hold and keep, so you have positive EBITDA and cash and dividends, and B, if you raise from VCs, you're going to look for either strategic or a private equity buyout. You got to know sometimes who could buy you out, what's the market trends in that, whether it's MarTech or HR tech, for example. Like, you got to understand what's the velocity in those deals. Sometimes when I was looking at sales flow in even other businesses, I was looking at the deal pipeline. What's the velocity of that market in terms of acquisition? That's a strong indicator of market confidence, ultimately, right? If you look at macroeconomics, and generally, then that gives you an indication that you're entering into a space that has a lot of movement. So your goal is to ultimately sell, but it's a matter of time, a right valuation of the future. For now, for example, for sales flow, we want to grow it to the next stage through different means. We're talking to a lot of different parties to kind of take it to the next level.
Yeah, and where's your next stage of growth? Is it going to new market sectors, or what does the future now look like for sales?
I think it's a good question, because ultimately right now, for example, whilst we're sort of really cementing the multi-channel angle of sales automation becomes quite critical, very LinkedIn led. Let's be frank, it's a powerful channel. It still remains powerful, even with 400 invites. Like, never mind 1,000 emails, it still works, and people still pay the same as they used to do 100 invites, for example, right? And that just shows that quality aspect of it becomes more important. But what changes is that if your price point of the business is 99 or 199, those guys outbound isn't really going to be for you at all. The AOV, the math doesn't add up. So what we're doing now is going a little bit more towards mid-market that not everybody's sort of typically doing in the space. I mean, some are, so it's a mixture, but not within sort of the methods that we're doing. That's why we had huge amounts of CRM integrations with HubSpot, with Salesforce, for example. So we're natively synced to try and push that data and organize that and focus on a sort of the mid segment, at least from an ICP perspective. And then secondly, it's really to do with the tech itself. We've already added AI before ChatGPT came out, so we had a lot of different features. We're doing icebreakers where you personalize messages beyond hi name or hi company to actually reviewing your LinkedIn profile and actually using a lot of snippets to personalize outreach. That typical SDR. So we're launching there, and data as well becomes really important, and focusing with that. We recently, for example, partnered up with Warmly to do intent and signal based outreach. So warm outbound, which is enriching your website data, sending that to Salesflow to then really convert that info. Because a lot of 2% conversion rate from website to demo or trial typically. So there's a lot of customers that you get on your site. You want to leverage that. So we're partnering up with Warmly to kind of get that data and then to prospect into those. You can double the rate, right, of conversion rate. And to do that, it's really important. It's the same with, investment. I know that, a lot of people listening to this podcast wondered, how am I going to get in front of people? And ultimately, you need to do a lot of automation, because you need at least, I think there was a statistic I saw somewhere online, you need 1,000, responses just to get to a really serious investment term sheets to be sent over to you. So I think, automation is going to be needed. You got to outreach both by email and LinkedIn directly to principal associates or general partners. And to do that, you do have to automate, And plus here, long as you can start engage, it's okay to automate. Long as you have the right data. And I think this is where a lot of people have to accumulate automation with the right data, because if you have the right data, you're going to increase your conversion rates of investor interest using both LinkedIn and email. The whole point of why we say multi-channel to a lot of different people is because you don't burn leads by just assuming if you go directly just LinkedIn. and nobody's following up, and you assume that no, they're not interested. It's not the case. That maybe they're not engaged there. They don't go onto LinkedIn. The same with email. Perhaps you got lost to spam that you're not aware of. So, and that's why you say, okay, do you know what? If somebody hasn't responded to my email, you go to LinkedIn and you outreach there. Can you imagine now? You all of a sudden you have double the touch points and double the opportunities for somebody to engage with you. So I think in hindsight, that statistics really becomes important for a lot of folks to secure those meetings, to secure investment.
Yeah, we tackle these are the same problems that we deal with the founders that we help connect with investors, specifically angel investors. One thing that we do is we check the activity level of the investors before reaching out to them. So it improves the statistics by a lot. So you only reach out to people that you see that are engaged on LinkedIn. If they don't reply, then it's probably not because they missed your message. But yeah, using an extra channel would definitely improve results, I'm sure, and it sounds like the right direction. Besnik, thanks so much. This was great. Before we go, I would really love you to share a few tips, 5 tips for the founders listening to the show from your experience so far.
Absolutely. So I think ultimately it's about, as I mentioned in my story, like you got to build sweat equity. What I mean right now is you have 100 or 50% of effectively nothing. And you need to show something, whether it's an MVP, whether it's some growth, some initial traction. And this is very typical, but you have to show it, because, at the end of the day, 1% I think it was 1% total company get funded. So I'd say put in some your own sweat equity. Make that equity valuable by adding IP or something beyond, before just assuming I have an idea, a napkin. You need to put on your own savings that you've done in your previous works or jobs, unless you're a student, in which case get a grant, get some innovation from your faculty, or go to accelerator if you're a different age. If you've got no experience, you need to understand your own circumstances as well. So here's about building your own sweat equity. A lot of the time, because I've met many, because I've invested, I've advised a lot of SaaS businesses and so forth, and a lot of them will want to get investment before napkin of an idea. In which case, your chance is not 1% anymore; they're 0.1. So to increase the chances of success, sorry,
especially now in today's market, sure.
Oh, I honestly, I totally agree. Things are, I guess, maybe picking up in the future, but right now you need more than sweat equity or just an IP. They want to see numbers that this is closer, to de-risk your opportunity there. So I would really say about, you have to put even more work now, and now all of a sudden Bootstrap is not becoming something just cool. It's a necessity, because you're showing as a business at minimal, not just capital, but resources, you can get revenue, right? And most people get VC money because they can grow what's already working faster. So then it becomes about speed. So I would say just sweat equity, and I don't mean it in the sense where you just don't get equity. I mean, you got to put in the work hard and build the MVP. If you can't build it, get a CTO. If you can go and get a CTO, go to an accelerator, match yourself up. So, or learn how to code, basically. So that would be my first one, is really around, it's a bit more philosophical, but sweat equity.
Yeah.
The next one, to increase, again, sort of the theme of chances of success, is make sure you've worked in a startup before. A lot of people here, when I talk, a lot of folks, they come from a corporate background sometimes. I'm like, you're about to enter. Do you know what you're going to go through right now, dude? Like, it's a whole different story. It's a whole different journey, and so either you have to work for a startup, or at least at minimum be a domain expert in the problem that you're going to solve. In my case, I was solving my own problem. There's no better person that really knows the core of the problem, the details, than your experience yourself, versus trying to solve someone else's problem, because you might not have been through the same experience. So the next one, really, it's about experience, even startups or your industry, because even if you get the money, you're still going to have to work hard and make it a success. You don't want to work 5 years, end up shut down the business and getting what? Just experience. Like, yes, it's valuable, but it's, it's not easy because the failure rates are still high. So I think to increase the success rate is really focus on working either in a startup before you do it, work on a side perhaps, but work in a startup, or really, really ideally in an industry that you're about to go into. So that's number two, perhaps. And I think next it's about most people should not get stuck into one experiment. Before I landed and realizing Facebook groups are going to be an initial channel of traction, there were a huge amounts of experimentation across different channels, different unconventional things that you don't even think of, whether it's Reddit or you're trying to do try a particular ad set that's going to work, but it's not yielding, or you want to try something else. I think most people is really experiment like wildfire, because at least at the beginning you can prove that this channel has enough volume to grow into. If you were to go into that pool and say, great, I got one customer there, but there's a lot more, for example, then if you use that statistic and data to your investors, okay, actually, I can see that this money is going to be used to pull more of that fish of that pond, for example, right? Ultimately, or it's a lake, even better. If it's an ocean, then, it's a different story. So I think first, just experiment to find that channel that will get you the first customers. Because if you say, how are you going to get customers you don't know, you're going to struggle to raise that money. Absolutely. That's what we did, huge amounts, even with Vision from a product perspective, MVP. When we got, we raised, I think, in Vision over 1.3 million with Gianluca. So, and now I think over time you kind of learn. And I think the next one is just about the further understanding unit economics. Like, not everybody comes from a finance background, but if you need to understand pricing strategies. You need to understand CAC, retention, churn. If you're on SaaS, I appreciate everybody is in different fields, but do you know your unit economics from top, middle, and lower of the funnel process? I'm not talking just marketing terms. I'm talking about payback periods. If you invest in this, when do you expect to be paid back if it's a recurring business? So I think these statistics you need to learn at minimum to be able to go to investors and say, this is how I'm going to be making you money. You raise maybe 100K or $1 million at least. What are you going to do with that money? How are you going to allocate resources? So put yourself as a fund manager, right? Because it's a CEO. You ultimately, apart from strategy and other things, you become a fund manager. You have to allocate resources to the right channels, to the right people in order to increase revenues, perhaps, So I think the tip here is, if you don't know your statistics top of the funnel, either get advisors. There's a growth mentor and a lot of advisors out there that can teach you how to do that. Be teach yourself all these statistics, or ultimately, if you don't do any of these, your investors, you're going to end up burning through leads because you got a meeting, someone loves your idea, but they don't think you cut out because you don't have, do you know what EBITDA and OPEX mean? Like of your cash flow statement? I'll be honest. In my early days, in my 3-4 ventures, I didn't know. I did obviously business law and business finance, but it's different in practice. And you don't know how to really ultimately apply it. So I learned huge amounts over the years, down to a point where it's second nature. So I'd say really understand your unit economics end to end, both from marketing all the way to finance and ops. And a final one, really, I think I think comes in resilience. Most people, I come from a background where I bootstrapped all these businesses over the last 12 years. And to come after 10 MVPs and still not make a dime takes a crazy mofo to get it done. I'm not going to swear, but ultimately you have to have a level of love for technology, in my case, love for what you're doing to actually make it work. So I think perseverance, even for investors, meaning that just because you haven't got to respond to a meeting after 6 months, after 1,000 people, and you got a great idea, but you do need that few million to really push it, you keep going for another year, ultimately. So I think here is just about eventually you'll find the right fit investors based on who they've invested in the past, and using the right tech to automate a lot of that, because it takes a lot of hard work and the right data set to make it work. So we've had many people even use Salesflow or other tools, by the way, in the market to try and scale that to increase the chances of success. Since the 5 tips here is actually how do you increase the chance of success both in fundraising but also for your business initially as a bootstrap.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much, Besnik. I think these were very, very interesting and useful, and I think a lot of them are stuff you said is relevant to raising capital, but it's also just in general to building a business that's successful, which ultimately, it seems sometimes people forget, ultimately, this is what startups are about, building a successful business. Okay, whoever's listening, please subscribe wherever you are, on Spotify, YouTube, wherever. And of course, if you haven't already, come to Meet.Capital, subscribe to our newsletter. I'll also add, you mentioned talking to an advisor. We have excellent advisors on board at Meet.Capital, including Ivan Ho, that can teach you about help you set your finances straight and build a financial plan with you. So check that out. Besnik, thanks so much. We'll include a link to Salesflow, of course. Anything else that people should know about?
No, I think you nailed the net. Zahi, thank you as well, equally. And I think financial planning, and let me tell you one minor, I totally agree that you need the right advisors, especially at the beginning. If it's your first time founders, especially, I can recommend it. I went through the trenches for this stuff, and I could have said, look at yourself to save millions in revenue, having the right advisors and the right people to help you plan and forecast. It's needed. So thank you for the invite and speaking, Zahi. Pleasure.
Thanks so much, Besnik. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.